I'm going to show you how to exposure bracket and how to shoot into the sun and deal with flare. I'll show you my process. It's super simple. Out here in Bryce Canyon, really nice morning. It's such a great park for sunrise. The sun just lights up the hoodoos, and it's just really just a spectacular place to be. It's one of my favorite sunrise spots probably anywhere. But the challenge is there's a ton of dynamic range. You're shooting into the sun, so all the hoodoos, I'm not sure if you can see, but all these hoodoos, they're pretty much in shadow until the sun gets pretty high. And one of those great shots is you're shooting into the sun, you get the sun star, but then how do you expose for super bright highlights, the sun and the sky, and also really dark shadows in the hoodoos. So that's what we're going to go through today. I'm going to walk you through my shot and how I exposure bracket. Now again, I'm going to show you a very easy process. You might have heard of something called auto bracketing or auto exposure bracketing. Most cameras do that, and that's a really easy way to exposure bracket. Throughout the years, I just like to do it manually. So I'll basically expose to the right, so I'm exposing for my highlights for the sun, and then I slowly back up and I'll take more exposures where I'm brightening. Now, one important thing to note is I'm always leaving my ISO and my aperture set. So for instance, if I'm shooting at f11 ISO 100, I'm leaving those settings dialed in. I'm only changing my shutter speed to adjust the exposure. So with most cameras, all you need really is 3 exposures, and that's going to be able to capture enough dynamic range in the scene. So you're going to need a dark exposure, that's an exposure for your highlights, kind of that mid-ground exposure, which is kind of a balance between dark and bright, and then you'll take a bright exposure, which is going to give you properly exposed highlights. So let's check it out. Let's get into what I was shooting this morning in Bryce Canyon. So the challenge here is dynamic range. So obviously the sun's coming up, getting a really nice sun star, but all the hoodoos are in shadow. So what I'm going to do is exposure bracket here. So first I'm basically going to turn my histogram on, and I'm going to expose to the right here. And I'm going to start right around f11. That's where I like a sun star. So I'm basically going to push this data as far to the right as I can with the histogram. And I'm going to take an exposure. And now what I'm going to do instead of auto exposure bracketing is I'm actually going to open up my shutter speed manually, and that's going to brighten up those shadows a little bit. So I'm just going to continue to do that manually, and you're going to see now I'm going to get some of the detail in the hoodoos that comes out. And what I'm going to do is blend these all together. And I'll just keep repeating that process. I'm looking at the sun, I'm going to get my sun star shot, I'm going to open up the exposure a little bit, bring my shadows back. Now, the other tricky thing is the sun star is producing a little bit of flare. So what I like to do is say I'm going to use an exposure like this for the shadows and the hoodoos. I'm going to take the exposure, and now what I'll actually do is I'm going to take another exposure, but I'm going to put my finger in front of the sun, and then I'm going to take an exposure. And I'll take a few of these just to make sure I'm getting it. And what that'll do is, if there is any flare, with that sun star, what'll happen is when I put my finger in front of the sun star, it'll block that flare, and I'll be able to open those as layers in Photoshop and basically clean all that flare up. But I'm just going to continue this process. Maybe I'll experiment with different aperture for my sun star, and I'll open up my exposure again, and I like to just do this over and over because the light is constantly changing, right? So I want to make sure that I capture the moment from when the sun comes up to when it's too high. Now there is another feature here. I could use auto bracketing, so I can actually tell my camera how many bracketed shots I want to do. So in most cases, with some of the great dynamic ranging cameras today, you can get away with 3 shots in either direction. So what this means is my camera's going to take 3 shots, and depending on what it's metering on or what I have it set at manually, it'll take 1 shot at those settings. It'll take it, you can see the increment here, this is stops, so it'll take 1 shot at 1 stop underexposed, and then I'll take 1 shot at one stop overexposed. So I don't use this feature. I like to just come in here. I like to do it manually. So, I just use my histogram, and I'll take some shots. Here, so I'm exposing to the right first, so I'm exposing for my highlights. I'm just moving my shutter speed, about a stop at a time. I'll take another, brightened up a little bit. I'll take another even brighter. And like I said, I'll continue to do this. And if I change my composition, I'm going to do this same process. And then I'll make sure that, I'm coming in here. I'm going to take some exposures where my finger is covering the sun, because even if you can't see it on the LCD, I guarantee that when you're shooting directly into the sun, you're 100% getting some, some flare. And this just makes it easy. If the flare is there, you can put these 2 images as layers in Photoshop, or however many you need. You can easily clean that flare up. So what we'll do is, I'm going to shoot for a little bit here, and then I'm going to open up these files in Lightroom and in Photoshop and work on actually blending them together, because it's a 2-step process. You need to get the exposures in the field, but then you also need to do some post-processing work. Beautiful morning at Bryce Canyon, though. These hoodoos just glow at sunrise. It's such a beautiful scene. Alright, so I'm back at my computer and I have all these exposures that I captured in the field. So I'm going to show you how easy it is to merge to HDR in Lightroom, and then I'm also going to show you how you can use Photoshop for really the utmost control. Just to reiterate what I was doing now, in the field I was exposing for dynamic range, and I was doing that through multiple exposures, and we call that exposure bracketing. So I've got 3 files here. I've got one that is overexposed. You can see my highlights are blown out, but the shadows have good detail. Then I have one exposure that's kind of in the middle. My shadows are still there. My highlights are a little bit darker, still blown out. And then I have one more exposure that's very underexposed, right? The shadows have pretty much lost that nice detail. They're too dark, but now I've brought back a lot of those highlights that were clipping in the sky. And just a note when I'm doing this is a good exposure for the sky and sun, in my opinion. So if I go over to my highlight clipping, you can see the sun is actually blown out here. I find that it actually looks weird though if you underexpose, or you continue to underexpose and take more exposures until you have, almost the entire sun not clipping. I mean, the sun is super bright, and I actually think it looks pretty good when the sun is a little bit blown out. So this is a good exposure to me. My main concern is everything going on in the sky. Like if I had clouds or anything like that, I need that to be properly exposed and not clipping. If the center of the sun, or that central portion of the sun, is a little bit overexposed, that's fine. Now I also have one more exposure, and this is where I stuck my finger in front of the sun to kind of handle any flare. And this is taken at the same exact settings as basically my first exposure for the shadows. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk through this process in Lightroom, and then we're going to go into Photoshop, and I'll show you how to do essentially the same thing. Now, I should mention with a sun flare, that is something that you need to do in Photoshop. But I'm going to show you how easy it is to merge to HDR in Lightroom. So let's take these 3 exposures. I'm going to select all of them. I'm going to right click on any of the 3 images that are selected. I'm going to go to Photo Merge HDR. And you can see, so Lightroom is going to output a preview for me, and let's just walk through these settings very quickly. Auto align, I leave this checked because even though I was on a tripod, if there is any movement frame to frame, Lightroom will line up each exposure so this final merge is seamless. I leave auto settings unchecked because I want the most control over processing my image. If I check this, Lightroom is going to apply a bunch of adjustments, and these never look good in my opinion. Now deghost, I leave this at none, but where you would use deghost is for a scenario like this. Let's say you had some branches maybe encroaching in the top here. Now, if those branches had leaves and those leaves were moving ever so slightly frame to frame, by adjusting the deghosting amounts here, Lightroom will actually try to correct for that movement. And then create stack is basically personal preference. If you check this box, it'll stack this merged HDR with your original files. Now the great thing about this is when I do click merge, Lightroom is going to merge these three raw files and actually output a raw file for me. So I'm not losing any data. I'm actually gaining data. So what Lightroom is doing is it's taking the histogram from these three, and I could have blended more, but I find 3 is a good spot. It's taking the histogram from those 3 images and basically merging it into one. So here's my output DNG right here, and DNG is just Adobe's raw file format. And you're probably thinking, hey, this doesn't look like an HDR image. This looks just like kind of that middle exposure that I had here. And yeah, that's true, but what's happening is all of the data is kind of built into this image. So everything is there. The highlight data is there, the shadow data is there as well. Really, the only change you'll notice over here is I can actually push exposure plus or minus 10 stops, where on a normal raw file, I can only do plus or minus 5. Now you would never want to push a file that much, but it's just kind of an indication that, okay, there's a lot more data in this HDR than these single raw files. So you can see it's super easy to merge these together. Now the output is a raw file, so there still needs to be some processing done. Now, what I would do with this image is obviously we need to bring up those dark areas and then maybe dial back the sky a little bit. So some basic adjustments that I might make, I might bring out the shadows a little bit to bring out that nice shadow detail. And then I might actually target the sky with a graduated filter. So I might pull a grad filter over the sky, and then I can adjust exposure and highlights to just bring back, some of the nice highlights in the sky. So here we go. We took 3 images, we merged them to HDR, and here's our output. And we can continue to process this, but the focus for this video really is how to do the merging and how to actually exposure blend using Lightroom. So as you can see, it's a very simple and easy process in Lightroom. And then when you do get this output, you can continue to process and make all those creative adjustments. Okay, I have all these layers open in Photoshop now. So we're going to walk through the blending process, and then we'll finish up by dealing with some of the sun flare in this scene. Now just a note, I will be showing some intermediate to more advanced techniques when it comes to this demonstration. But Photoshop is my preferred method because of the great control it gives you. Okay, so the first thing I like to do is order my layers. So to start, I've got my layer right here for the sun flare. I'm going to turn that off because we're going to get to that after all the blending. So I'm going to take my brightest exposure, which is this top one. I'm actually going to drag it down. And then I'm going to order the layers above. So what I want is, I basically want the brighter exposure. I want my middle exposure, which is this one on the top. And then I want my darkest exposure. And I like to work with 2 layers at a time. So I'm going to toggle off that dark layer and, well, that dark exposure, and I'm just going to start with these 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is put a black layer mask on this kind of, base exposure. So I'm going to do that by holding down Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac, and then I'm going to click on the layer mask icon. And, with layer masking, black conceals, white reveals. So black is concealing this layer. Now I'm going to use luminosity masks to do this blend. So I'm going to go up here to the TK Basic panel. This is a extension you can get for Photoshop. It is free, but it's my way to kind of generate luminosity masks. I know there's other options out there as well. But what I want to do here is find one of these lights options, one of these lights luminosity masks that targets the brighter areas of the image. So 2 and 3 look pretty good, and I'm thinking about this mask or this selection in terms of how it will act as a mask on this layer. So a lot of the layer will be revealed in the sky here, which is what we want, and not much below. So what I'm actually going to do is toggle this lights 2 as a selection, and then I'm going to come over here to the layer mask. And I like to hide these marching ants. They just indicate I have an active selection. I'm going to hold down Control or Command H. That will hide them, but my selection is still active. And I'm going to grab my brush tool, so you can press B or click on this icon, and I'm going to make sure that this foreground color here is set to white. And then I like to start around a 50% opacity, and I'm just going to start painting. And my brush strokes are going to be contained within that Lights 2 selection, or that Lights 2 luminosity mask. So I've made some brush strokes here, and you can see the mask reflects that. Let's just look. Here's before, here's after. So look at our, one pass already, and look at, what's happened. I've really brought back a lot of that dynamic range in the sky. And that looks good to me. So again, I like to work on 2 layers at a time. So this looks good. So now I'm going to come up, toggle on that top layer, and now I'm going to work pretty much between the top layer and, technically I am working with 3 layers, but I like to think of, this blend and this masking I just did. Now I have this output, which is what we're seeing here. So technically it's 2 layers, but, this is pretty much the scene and the result we've gotten from merging these 2 layers together using masks. So I'm going to toggle on this top layer, same process. I'm actually going to hold down Control or Command D to deselect that light selection, because remember I hid it. It was still active though. So if I would have added a layer mask, it would have automatically applied that Lights 2 selection, and I don't want to do that. I want to control with a brush stroke where this layer is going to shine through, or what I'm going to blend in from this layer. So same process. I'll hold down Alt or Option, and I'm going to click on the layer mask icon. That gives me the black layer mask. So now I'm gonna paint in the sections that I want. So same thing. I think I'm gonna use this this Lights 2 mask again. Could potentially use Lights 3, but I think I'm gonna stick with Lights 2. We'll see what our results are like. I'm gonna toggle it as a selection. I'm gonna go over to my layer mask. I'll hit Control or Command H. I've got my brush. I'm gonna stick with 50% opacity, and then I'm just going to continue to kind of paint in that sky. And as I get closer to the sun here, I might drop my opacity down a little bit, maybe around 25%. I'll make my brush a little bit smaller and kind of feather in those really bright areas. So let's look. Here's before, here's after. So that looks good to me. So let's just look where we started. Here's that bright exposure, right? Sky is blown out. Here's kind of that base middle exposure, and then here's that darker one. And look at all the dynamic range we've brought back. Now, I'm not going to process this image further because I just want to demonstrate how to actually do the exposure blending. But if I wanted to, I could continue brightening the shadows in this area. I can make some color adjustments. So, I can do anything I'd normally do in Photoshop. But I just hope you guys can see, how useful this is and how seamless blending can be in Photoshop when you're using luminosity masks. So let's do one more here. Here's our exposure for the shadows. We blended in a little bit of sky and then used that darker exposure and really brought back a lot of dynamic range. And now everything's there, right? We've got data for our shadows all the way through data for our highlights and really bright sun. Okay, now let's tackle this sun flare. So I'm going to grab that sun flare layer. I'm going to bring it to the top and toggle it on. And I don't have a lot of flare in this scene, honestly. There's a little bit right here and a little blotchiness here that I'll try and clean up. My lens that I was using for this shoot handles flare extremely well. The coating is great. The old lens I used to use, which was Nikon's 14-24, I would have flare everywhere. I mean, it'd be in the corners here. I'd have like green rings in the corners and flare everywhere. So it varies lens to lens. When I'm in the field, I always play it safe. I always take an exposure where my finger is blocking the sun, because if I do have flare, I can clean it up this way. And to clean up flare, it's very simple exposure blending. It's doing the same process, but we don't have to use luminosity masks. So I'm going to put a black layer mask on. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option, click on the layer mask icon, and this is actually a good demonstration. So if you do have an active selection, which I did, you can see what just happened, right? It's automatically going to apply that. So I'm actually going to step back by pressing Control or Command Z. And a good thing to always remember is, after you're using a mask or using a luminosity selection, just deselect. So Control or Command D, And now when I hold down Alt or Option and I clicked add a layer mask, there we go. This is what we want. So I'm going to zoom in. There is a little bit of flare here. So I'm going to grab my brush and I'm going to switch to white, and let's do 50% opacity again. And I'll make my brush a little bit smaller, and I'm just going to click here, and you can see it cleaned up that flare, right? Here's before, here's after. Flare's gone. And there's a little bit of smudging happening here, so I can clean up this entire area as well. And sometimes I like to just zoom out a little bit to make sure I'm not creating like a harsh transition anywhere by blending in this flare exposure. And that's why it's very important that the exposure you use to fix flare is identical to the exposure you're using for your shadows. So let's do before and after. You can see all that flare is cleaned up, right? Let's do it once more. And very easy, right? So next time you're out, do your exposure bracketing and just stick your finger in front of the sun, take some exposures, because if you do have flare, you can easily clean it up in Photoshop. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you learned something. And no matter what your processing level is, it's easy to do an HDR blend in Lightroom. If you want to take it a step further, you can do some really cool exposure blending using advanced selections in Photoshop. And you can also clean up sun flare. So, like I said, I hope you learned something. There's a process in the field, right? It's getting the exposures in the field. And then when we get back and we're post-processing, there's a lot of cool stuff we can do with these exposures, from blending them together to cleaning up flare. And now we've put ourselves in a really great position to, process this image basically to its finish and really bring out a lot of the great light and color that was there this morning in Bryce Canyon. So thanks for watching, guys. If you do have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video. Thanks.